September 1969. A helicopter climbs off the coast of Oxnard, California, low and fast, simulating a combat attack run. A chase plane trails behind it. Then smoke. Witnesses on the beach see it first. A thin plume trailing from the fuselage. Then flame. Then the sound. An explosion, sharp and final, carrying across the water. The tail rotor separated and fell, and the whole aircraft was falling apart, one witness would say. I saw no survivors. The wreckage sinks. Search teams recover fragments. Days later, a piece of a flight helmet washes up on the sand. Stenciled on the inside. A name. The pilot's name. He was a Lockheed engineering test pilot. A veteran of Vietnam. He did not survive. This was not the first Cheyenne to come apart in the air. It would not be the last. The machine was supposed to be the deadliest helicopter in American history. Faster than anything the Army had ever flown. Armed heavier than anything with rotors had ever been armed. It was supposed to make every attack helicopter that came before it obsolete. It never fired a shot in anger. It never left American soil. And within 3 years the United States Congress would kill it. Not with a bullet, but with a vote. This is the story of how that happened. 1965. Vietnam. Every transport helicopter in the U.S. Army fleet shared the same design compromise, and every pilot who flew one knew it in his stomach before he ever put it into words. The workhorse was the Huey, the UH-1. Thin aluminum skin. A crew compartment that could stop nothing heavier than shrapnel. No armor plating worth the name. When it carried troops into a landing zone, it carried them into small arms range at a hover, low and slow, exposed on every side. The Army's answer, in the early years, was improvisation. Door gunners leaning out of open bays with M60 machine guns bolted to makeshift mounts. Huey gunships. The same airframe, the same fragile skin. Now carrying rocket pods it was never built to balance. It worked. It also burned. Vietnam saw helicopter losses climb into the thousands, and a meaningful share of them went down not in dogfights, but in the 90 seconds after touchdown, when a transport was at its most naked, and the enemy knew exactly where to aim. This was not treated as a flaw. It was treated as the cost of doing business. Every officer who signed off on a mission plan accepted it as the price of vertical assault. You fly slow, you fly low, and for a few seconds you are unprotected. There was no helicopter in the American arsenal built from the ground up to solve that problem, to fly fast enough to escort a formation, to carry enough firepower to suppress a landing zone before the troops ever touched ground, to survive the very envelope of speed and altitude where every other rotorcraft was weakest. It was not that no one had thought of it. It was that no one had built it. The physics of a helicopter, a single main rotor fighting gravity, torque, and its own top speed, seemed to make the idea a contradiction in terms. A helicopter that flew like a fighter was, by the conventional wisdom of 1965, not a design problem. It was a fantasy. The Army decided to fund the fantasy anyway. The program had a name only a bureaucracy could love: the Advanced Aerial Fire Support System, or AAFSS. Stripped of the acronym, the requirement was simple to state and brutal to build. The Army wanted a helicopter that could outfly a Huey formation, arrive ahead of it, and clear the landing zone before the transports were ever exposed. Speed, firepower, and survivability in a single airframe, on a timeline the Pentagon wanted measured in months, not years. 3 defense contractors answered the call, and one of them had no business being in a helicopter competition at all. Sikorsky entered, the company that had spent 2 decades defining what an American helicopter looked like, the natural favorite. Convair entered with a design so radical, so far from anything flying, that engineers who saw the proposal described it as looking like it belonged on a different planet. And Lockheed entered. Lockheed built fighter jets. Lockheed built spy planes that flew at the edge of space. Lockheed's name was stamped on the U-2 and would soon be stamped on the SR-71 Blackbird. Airframes built for speed, for altitude, for pushing the limits of fixed-wing flight. Lockheed had almost no history building rotorcraft for the U.S. military at scale. And yet Lockheed's engineers had spent years quietly experimenting with an idea that Sikorsky, the helicopter establishment, had never fully committed to: the rigid rotor. Conventional helicopter rotors flex. Blades tilt independently, hinge and flap with every gust and every maneuver, because that flexibility is what keeps the aircraft controllable. Lockheed's engineers had built and flown a smaller research aircraft, the AH-51, using a rotor system that did the opposite: rigid, locked, transmitting control inputs directly and instantly into the airframe. It was a fighter pilot's helicopter, built by a fighter jet company, and paired with a stub wing to offload lift at speed and a pusher propeller mounted at the tail to provide raw forward thrust independent of the main rotor. Lockheed's design promised something no pure helicopter had ever delivered: the maneuverability of a rotorcraft married to the dash speed of an airplane. The Army named the concept the compound helicopter, a machine that flew like a helicopter at low speed and transitioned, in the same airframe, into something closer to a fixed-wing aircraft at high speed. On March 23, 1966, the Army made its decision. Lockheed had won a contract for 10 prototypes, worth $12.75 million, designated the aircraft the AH-56A. The Army would soon give it a name that promised violence: Cheyenne. The odd contractor in the room, the fighter jet company that had never built a combat helicopter, had just beaten Sikorsky at Sikorsky's own game. Nobody in the industry saw it coming, and nobody yet knew that the same boldness that let Lockheed win this contract was about to become the very thing that made the aircraft impossible to finish. By the spring of 1967, the design on paper had become a machine on the tarmac at Lockheed's Van Nuys plant. On May 3rd, the company held a rollout ceremony. What stood on the ramp that day looked like nothing the U.S. Army had ever fielded. The rotor was the heart of it. 4 rigid blades, mounted to a hub that did not flex, did not hinge, did not flap the way every other production helicopter rotor did. Rigid rotor, a main rotor system that transmits pitch and control changes directly through a stiff hub instead of letting the blades articulate independently. The advantage was responsiveness. A pilot's input on a rigid rotor aircraft reached the airframe almost instantly, with none of the lag that came from a conventional articulated system. It made the Cheyenne capable of maneuvers no other helicopter in the world could perform: snap rolls, precision aerobatics, the kind of handling normally reserved for fixed-wing fighters. Beneath the rotor sat a stub wing, mounted low on the fuselage, a short, fixed wing that generates lift at speed, taking weight off the main rotor so the aircraft could fly faster without overstressing its blades. And at the tail, where a conventional helicopter had nothing but an anti-torque rotor, the Cheyenne carried a 3-bladed pusher propeller, a rear-facing propeller that provides forward thrust independent of the main rotor, functioning less like a helicopter accessory and more like the engine of an airplane bolted onto the back of one. The result, on paper, was a helicopter that behaved like 2 aircraft in one. At a hover, it flew like an unirotorcraft: vertical takeoff, sideways drift, the ability to sit motionless over a single point on the ground, but pushed the throttle forward, and the compound design took over. The wing began carrying the weight, the pusher propeller began carrying the thrust, and the Cheyenne stopped behaving like a helicopter altogether. The numbers backed up the ambition: a 4-bladed tail rotor for anti-torque control, a General Electric T64 turboshaft engine producing over 3,400 shaft horsepower, a fuselage stretching nearly 55 feet from nose to tail, and in the cockpit, a configuration no attack helicopter had used before: 2 seats in tandem, the pilot flying from the rear, a co-pilot and gunner seated forward, operating a fire control system that could aim the aircraft's weapons independently of where the airframe itself was pointed, a gunner who could track a target off to the side while the pilot flew the aircraft straight ahead. On September 21, 1967, the Cheyenne left the ground for the first time, and in the months that followed, it did something no compound helicopter had done before at this scale: it went fast. Official testing would eventually clock the aircraft at 277 miles per hour in level flight, a speed that outran every conventional helicopter of its era by more than 100 miles an hour. For comparison, the Huey it was meant to escort topped out around 135. The engineers who had built it believed they had solved the contradiction that had defined helicopter design since the Second World War. They believed they had built a machine that could fly like a fighter and fight like a gunship in the same airframe. What they had actually built was a machine flying at the outer edge of what 1960s aerospace engineering could reliably control, and the industry was about to find out exactly how far that edge extended, the hard way. By January of 1968, the Cheyenne was no longer just a prototype impressing test pilots on a runway in California. It was a program with momentum, and momentum, in the Pentagon, meant money. On January 8th, the Secretary of Defense approved pre-production funding. The order on the table, 375 aircraft. Not 10. Not a handful of test articles for the Army to evaluate at its leisure. 375 combat-ready Cheyennes, destined to become the backbone of American Army aviation for a generation. Flight testing had barely begun in earnest. The aircraft had first flown less than 4 months earlier, and already the Pentagon was writing checks as if the hardest problems had already been solved. That optimism had a name inside the Army. Total Package Production, a procurement strategy that folded design, engineering, and manufacturing into a single continuous contract. Instead of pausing between phases to confirm the aircraft actually worked as promised, it was designed to move fast. It assumed the risk out from under the government's feet and placed it instead on the contractor, on Lockheed. If the design held up, the Army got its helicopter years ahead of a traditional program. If it didn't, there was no built-in point to stop and reconsider before the money was already spent. Nobody paused to reconsider. Congress had authorized the funds. The Army had a war in Vietnam that made every day of delay feel like a day too many. Lockheed had a production line ready in Van Nuys. Every incentive in the system pointed toward speed, and every one of those incentives pointed away from caution. And yet, quietly, a second helicopter was already flying beside the Cheyenne, one nobody was calling the future of Army aviation. Bell Helicopter had been asked to build something far less ambitious, a stopgap. Take the proven transmission and engine from the workhorse, UH-1 Huey, wrap it in a narrow, low-drag fuselage, mount a chin turret underneath, and call it done. No rigid rotor, no stub wing, no pusher propeller, no fire control system that let a gunner track a target. Independent of the pilot's flight path, just a fast, simple armed helicopter that could reach Vietnam while the Army waited for the real answer to arrive. The Army designated it the AH-1G. The troops would come to call it the Cobra. It was never meant to compete with the Cheyenne. It was meant to hold the line until the Cheyenne was ready. A placeholder, built cheap and fast, filling a gap that the far more sophisticated aircraft was expected to close within a few short years. Nobody in early 1968 thought the placeholder would outlast the machine it was standing in for. Nobody thought the stopgap would still be flying combat missions in Army colors more than 3 decades later, while the machine built to replace it would never fire a single shot in anger. But that is exactly what was about to happen. And the first sign of why came less than 14 months later. Off the coast of California, in a fireball that investigators would spend years trying to fully explain. March 12, 1969. A Cheyenne prototype, the third of 10 built, was in the air on a routine test flight when something in its rotor system began to shake apart. The main rotor, spinning at full speed, pitched violently out of its normal plane of motion and struck the fuselage itself, slicing into the front and rear of the aircraft it was supposed to be lifting. The helicopter came apart in mid-air. The pilot did not survive. Investigators traced the failure to a phenomenon that had a name inside the engineering community, but almost no public recognition. Pilot-induced oscillation coupled with a rigid rotor's unique sensitivity to control input at high speed. A chain reaction where a small correction by the pilot fed back into the rotor system faster than the rotor could stabilize. Each cycle of the feedback loop larger than the last. Until the blades were swinging through an arc the airframe was never built to survive. The very feature that made the Cheyenne fly like nothing else in the sky. A rigid rotor transmitting control inputs instantly, with none of the natural damping that a conventional articulated rotor provided, was also the feature that under the wrong conditions could turn a helicopter into a machine trying to tear itself apart. Lockheed's engineers went to work on a fix. And in September of that same year, they thought they had found a controlled way to study the problem without risking another pilot's life. Put a Cheyenne prototype into a wind tunnel at NASA's Ames Research Center, mount it rigidly to the test rig, and run the rotor up to speed under laboratory conditions, monitored by instruments instead of a man in the cockpit. It was meant to be the safe version of the test. It became the second aircraft lost that year. The wind tunnel rig held the helicopter fixed in space, bolted down, unable to shift or drift the way a real aircraft naturally does in flight. In the air, a Cheyenne could move fractionally in response to its own rotor's vibrations. And that small, constant freedom of motion acted as a kind of natural shock absorber, bleeding off energy before it could build into something dangerous. Locked rigidly into the wind tunnel mounts, the aircraft had no such give. When engineers pushed the rotor into high-speed conditions designed to reproduce the same vibration pattern that had destroyed the March prototype, there was nowhere for that energy to go. The oscillation that the aircraft would have naturally damped in free flight instead built on itself, uncontrolled. Sided tests meant to make the aircraft safer. The rotor blades began to pitch beyond their limits. Remote operators controlling the aircraft from outside the tunnel had none of the physical, seat-of-the-pants feedback a pilot in the cockpit would have felt. No sense of the aircraft beginning to shudder. No instinct telling them to back off the controls before the motion became unrecoverable. By the time the instruments showed what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. The oscillations accelerated. The rotor struck the tail boom, and a second Cheyenne prototype was destroyed, this one in a supposedly controlled laboratory environment, built specifically to prevent exactly this outcome. 2 prototypes gone in 6 months, 1 pilot dead. A rotor system that behaved unpredictably both in free flight and, it now turned out, even when nailed down and studied under laboratory conditions. Lockheed's engineers began modifying the design, chasing the vibration problem through every version of the aircraft that remained, and as a precaution, an admission in hardware that the danger had not yet been solved. One of the surviving prototypes was fitted with something no earlier Cheyenne had carried, an ejection seat. A helicopter, built to escort troops into the most dangerous few seconds of a combat landing, now needed an emergency exit built into its own test program just for its engineering test pilots to fly it safely on a calm day over California. The aircraft had not yet fired a shot at an enemy. It had already killed one of its own. The first blow came fast, and it came from inside the Army's own procurement office. On May 19, 1960, barely 2 months after a prototype had killed its pilot, barely 8 months after the wind tunnel had destroyed a second one, the Army canceled the production contract. Not the program, not yet, but the deal for 375 combat-ready aircraft. The order that had defined the Cheyenne's future since January of 1968 was gone. Development would continue. The promise of mass production would not. Lockheed kept building, kept testing, kept modifying the rotor system, chasing the vibration problem through one design revision after another, spending years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to prove that the aircraft the Army had already once written off could still be saved. But the deadlier threat to the Cheyenne was never really about vibration. It was about turf. Since 1948, an agreement signed at Key West, Florida, had drawn an invisible line through American military aviation, a line dividing which branch of the armed forces owned which piece of the sky. Close air support, the mission of hitting enemy ground forces to protect friendly troops below, had long been treated as Air Force territory. The Cheyenne did not just threaten to be an expensive helicopter. It threatened to be a helicopter good enough to make the Air Force's own close air support mission irrelevant to the Army's needs. A machine so fast and so heavily armed that the Army would no longer need to ask the Air Force for cover at all. By 1971, that threat had a name and a growing constituency inside the Pentagon. The AX program, the Air Force's answer to the same battlefield problem, which would eventually become the A-10 Thunderbolt. 2 services, 2 aircraft, 1 mission. And in the tightening defense budgets of a war winding down, Congress was no longer willing to fund both. On October 22, 1971, the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Tactical Air Power opened hearings to settle the question. The testimony that did the most damage to the Cheyenne did not come from an accountant or an engineer. It came from a general. General William W. Maumier, commander of the Air Force's Tactical Air Command, took the stand and cited something no defense contractor could out-engineer: casualty numbers. Maumier pointed to Operation Lamson 719, the brutal 1971 incursion into Laos, where American helicopters had taken devastating losses under enemy fire. His argument was not abstract. It was the blunt suggestion that helicopters, expensive, complex, vulnerable helicopters like the Cheyenne, were not the answer the Army believed they were. A fixed-wing aircraft, armored and gun-heavy, might do the job for less money and less risk to the men flying it. The Army did not surrender without a fight. In January 1972, it convened a special task force to reevaluate the Cheyenne's requirements, hunting for a version of the aircraft that could survive the political battle, even if it meant compromising the technical ambition that had defined the program from the start. And in early 1972, hoping to silence the doubters with a demonstration no hearing room testimony could match, the Army staged a live-fire exhibition for the Senate Armed Services Committee at the Yuma Proving Grounds in Arizona. The Cheyenne had already fired 130 TOW anti-tank missiles successfully in prior testing. On the day that mattered most, in front of the senators who controlled its fate, the first missile fired that morning failed on launch and dropped to the ground. It was a missile malfunction, not a flaw in the helicopter. The distinction did not matter. The senators in the bleachers had come to watch the Army prove the Cheyenne deserved to survive, and what they watched instead was a public failure, captured in front of the very committee that held the program's budget in its hands. By then, the unit cost of a single Cheyenne had climbed past $4 million, 8 times the original estimate from 1966. More than $400 million had already been spent. And in the Senate's judgment, 2 nearly identical answers to the same battlefield question, the Army's Cheyenne and the Air Force's AX, was one answer too many. On August 9, 1972, the Secretary of the Army made it official. The Cheyenne program was canceled. 10 prototypes had been built. 2 pilots and engineers had died testing them. Not one had ever crossed into a war zone, and the machine designed to be the deadliest helicopter in the American arsenal was killed not by an enemy gunner, not by a design flaw beyond repair, but by a line item struck from a budget and a vote in a committee room 3,000 miles from the war it was built to fight. The cancellation left a hole in Army aviation that had technically already been filled, just not the way anyone had planned. The AH-1 Cobra, the stopgap that Bell had built in a hurry back in 1968 using a Huey's engine and transmission wrapped in a slimmer fuselage, was never supposed to be a long-term answer. It was supposed to hold the line for a few years until the Cheyenne matured into full production. Instead, with the Cheyenne gone, the placeholder became the plan. The Cobra kept flying combat missions through the final years of Vietnam, kept receiving upgrades, new sights, new rockets, and eventually the same TOW anti-tank missile system the Cheyenne had been demonstrating at Yuma the day its own program collapsed. A helicopter designed as a temporary fix ended up carrying the Army's attack helicopter mission for over a decade past the date its replacement was supposed to have already retired it. But a temporary fix was not what the Army had wanted in 1965, and it was not what the Army still needed in 1972. The battlefield requirement that had justified the Cheyenne in the first place, a purpose-built attack helicopter, survivable, heavily armed, fast enough to escort a formation into contested airspace, had not gone away. Only the Cheyenne had. So the Army started over. Almost immediately after killing the Cheyenne, it opened a new competition, the Advanced Attack Helicopter Program, or AAH. And this time, the requirements themselves carried the scars of everything that had just gone wrong. Where the Cheyenne had chased raw dash speed, 220 knots, a rigid rotor, a pusher propeller, a stub wing, an airframe that behaved like two different aircraft depending on how fast it was flying. The new specification pulled back. Survivability over speed. A conventional articulated rotor system instead of the temperamental rigid hub that had killed two test pilots. Simplified avionics. Instead of a fire control system built at the edge of what the era's engineering could reliably deliver. The Army had learned its lesson, and the lesson was written directly into the numbers. Target flyaway cost near $1.5 million, a fraction of what a Cheyenne had cost by the time it died. Two companies stepped into the new competition, and one of them was not Lockheed. Bell entered a design, the AH-56, and Hughes Helicopters, a company with none of Lockheed's fighter jet pedigree, none of its reputation for pushing past the edge of what was possible, entered a design built explicitly to be less ambitious than the machine it was replacing. Simpler, slower, harder to kill. The Army chose the Hughes design. It would take another 12 years of development, testing, and refinement before that aircraft entered service in 1984 as the AH-64 Apache, the helicopter that would go on to define American attack aviation for the rest of the 20th century and into the next. 12 years, on top of the 7 the Cheyenne had already burned. 19 years, start to finish. Between the moment the Army first decided it needed a dedicated attack helicopter and the moment one finally reached a combat unit ready to fight, the Cheyenne had promised to close that gap in half the time. Instead, its failure became the blueprint for exactly what its replacement was built not to repeat. Walk onto any American military airfield today, and you can still see the shadow of what the Cheyenne started, even though the aircraft itself never fired a shot at an enemy soldier. The AH-64 Apache that eventually replaced it did not just inherit a mission. It inherited a warning. Every engineering decision that shaped the Apache, the conventional rotor instead of the rigid hub, the emphasis on survivability over raw speed, the deliberate simplicity of a design built to be finished on schedule instead of pushed to the edge of what physics would allow, was a direct answer to a question the Cheyenne had already asked, expensively, at the cost of 2 men's lives. The Apache would go on to fly in Panama, in the Gulf War, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, becoming one of the most combat-tested attack helicopters in American history. It succeeded, in large part, because the Army had already learned, the hard way, on the Cheyenne's dime, exactly what not to build. The technology did not disappear either. The rigid rotor concept that had made the Cheyenne so maneuverable and so unstable did not die in that wind tunnel at NASA Ames. Decades later, Sikorsky would return to rigid coaxial rotor designs for experimental high-speed helicopters, chasing the same dream of a rotorcraft that could fly like a fighter jet, this time with computer flight controls and materials science that 1960s engineers never had access to. The idea the Cheyenne had died proving was too dangerous to fly in 1969 was not wrong. It was simply decades ahead of the technology needed to control it safely. Was the Army wrong to want it? No. The threat the Cheyenne was built to answer, helicopters exposed and unprotected in the seconds after they touched down in a hot landing zone, was real, and it killed American soldiers in Vietnam by the thousands. Was Lockheed wrong to build it the way it did? That answer is less comfortable. A fighter jet company, with no production history in military helicopters, had bet an entire aircraft's survival on a rotor system, so aggressive that even NASA's own test engineers could not run it safely on the ground. The ambition was not misplaced. The execution outran what 1960s engineering and 1960s testing procedures could reliably deliver. Two philosophies stood on opposite sides of that gap, and history handed the verdict to only one of them. The Cheyenne's philosophy was addition. More speed, more complexity, more capability stacked into a single airframe until it could do everything at once. The Apache's philosophy, born directly from the wreckage of the program before it, was subtraction. Strip away everything that was not essential to surviving the fight, and build only what could actually be finished, tested, and trusted. One philosophy produced a machine that never left American soil. The other produced a machine that is still flying combat missions more than 40 years later. 10 prototypes were built. 2 were destroyed in testing. Not one ever crossed into a war zone. The Army spent more than $400 million, and Congress spent 1 vote, and between them they ended a program that had once been called the future of American combat aviation. It was supposed to be the deadliest helicopter America ever built. It never fought a single battle. It only lost one, in a hearing room, 3,000 miles from the war.